Welcome, and really thank you for sticking it around at late afternoon on Saturday with beautiful weather. So, I'm associate professor at UMass Lowell, about 30 miles outside of Boston. And motivation for this. So I teach entrepreneurship, but more importantly, I do research. Well, not more importantly, but more importantly for this talk, I do research in entrepreneurial finance. I do a lot of reviewing in entrepreneurial finance. And through that process, I'm kind of thinking maybe we got it a little bit wrong in the things that we emphasize. Not wrong per se, but we can do a lot better. So typically you'll see a situation portrayed like this, where you've got an entrepreneur pitching to some investors who don't have any idea what's going on, and it's up to the entrepreneur to convey that, and he does, right? He has some underlying knowledge about his own ability, his skills, the venture, and he needs to convey that through what we frequently refer to as signaling. So this is an asymmetric asymmetric information situation where he's got the information, needs to convey that to the investors. But, you know, I'm not sure that really characterizes it all that well. I think, yeah, you got an entrepreneur pitching to some investors and they have no idea what's going on, but neither does the entrepreneur, right? So rather than kind of an asymmetric information situation, I think what we got is symmetric ignorance. No one really knows what's going on. And so we really need to maybe rethink the framework for how we frame the decision-making process in an entrepreneurial finance context. So in particular, I'm going to push back on signaling, even though I use it in my own research. Hey, you probably do too. Yeah, she uses it in her research. Pretty much anybody who does any work in entrepreneurial finance uses a signaling approach. But I'm not going to go through all these. I'm going to kind of elaborate this more in the paper itself. But I think you'll see what I've highlighted are the basic underlying assumptions that signaling rests on. Some of these are maybe explicitly stated, but most of them probably aren't. Most of them, if you really sit down and think about it and analyze them and look at it really closely, you'll say, no, you know what? I don't think these are really that valid in most entrepreneurial finance contexts. I'm not going to say it's not completely invalid, but I think many of these assumptions rest on a situation that's probably not valid in most observable situations. And so in kind of keeping with the theme of the conference, I'm thinking what we really need to do is re-engage the funder. One thing I think what signaling does, even though there is more research recently putting more emphasis on the funder, him or herself, I do think that approach in general kind of leaves the funder on the sidelines. And so what I'm going to do is say, yeah, we don't want to throw away everything that we have with signaling. An important element that it brings is this concept of evidence. And so I'm relying on this unimodel of persuasion, which basically says someone in a decision-making framework looks at the evidence, and that's information that's relevant to the decision at hand. And what's relevant to them is the mental connection they make between that evidence and the conclusion they want to make. And now what's important here is that what's relevant for a given funder may not be relevant for another funder or another funder. And I think that's what we kind of lose out when we kind of really emphasize and focus just on the signaling approach. Now there are going to be some enabling conditions, so how difficult the decision-making task is, also related to the funder, their underlying capability, both in terms of kind of the knowledge and skills they bring, but then also the capacity, which more refers to are they distracted in the moment? How much are they paying attention to the decision at hand? So that's this unimodel of persuasion. It really says, okay, we have to determine what's relevant for a funder. In order to do that, I'm going to rely on recent work that's been done at the founder level related to founder identity. And I'm going to say, you know what? We can actually bring a lot of this into the funder concept. And I've created these, what I call funder identities, that pretty well parallel. So if you look at the work that Fochart and Gruber did, where they delineated these three different founder identities, what they call Darwinian, communitarian, and missionary, but they actually go back to drawing on prior social psychological work that really frames these as individualistic, relational, or collectivistic. And what I'm going to suggest is that these really map well onto the identities that funders bring in a particular context. Doesn't mean they bring the same one. In fact, they could, one thing that's nice about this framework is I may have an individualistic identity in one context and a relational in another context. And I won't go into all these boxes, but just kind of walk through maybe the first one, individualistic. On the left are these different elements that you can use to differentiate the different identity types. And so for the individualistic, they're really focused on themselves. They're motivated by self-interest. They really, when they're evaluating themselves, they pay attention to their traits, and then they compare those traits to others, often their competitors. When it comes to governance mechanisms in a funding context, I suggest they rely very heavily on formal contracts. In terms of financial motivation, they're looking at maximizing returns. Values they ascribe to are achievement and power. Similarly, you can do the same kind of thing for relational and collectivistic. One way to think about this might be a faculty member. So a faculty member, when they start out, probably has very much an individualistic identity orientation. But as they progress in their career, as they become tenured, they start thinking about mentoring junior faculty, and then they put themselves in a social context. So these are all about how the self is situated in a social context and how that self is framed. So it's either framed as an individual, framed as a part of a pair, a relationship, or it's framed as sort of some part of collectivistic we orientation. The first two are kind of really more me orientations. The third is kind of a we, which is really kind of very transitory. So going back to the faculty member, she may take on a very individualistic role. She may advance to a relational role, but perhaps she's part of a union and they're negotiating with the administration. And then she takes on a we collectivistic identity. So these are the different identity orientations that will drive how this evidence is interpreted and then responded to. So these are the identity orientations, and then I incorporate them all into what I'm calling the socio-cognitive framework of entrepreneurial finance. So these follow both top-down and bottom-up approaches. The key is that the identity is going to be intersecting or interacting with the evidence through this process of noticing and interpreting the evidence. And then I have these different contingencies, which I'll elaborate when I get to the propositions on the next slide. So a top-down approach is basically starting at a very goal-driven mental model schema. This is where the identity becomes really established first and foremost. We'll really direct what evidence the particular funder looks for, what they notice, and how they interpret it. But similarly, it could be, and that's how probably most of the processes will unfold. I think in some occasions there will be bottom-up processes as well. This is where it's more sensory driven. So an entrepreneur is listening to a pitch. The investor is watching a pitch. The entrepreneur is very enthusiastic, right? Through emotional contagion, they're enthusiastic. That enthusiasm spreads to the funder. The funder feels good, right? That's very much a sensory stimuli. But then the investor needs to interpret that. And I'm going to say that the way they will interpret that sensory stimulus is through their identity orientation. And then that would be an example of a bottom-up approach. So drawing on this, I come up with a series of propositions. Again, this is just a theoretical piece. And it starts with the importance of the identity orientation. And what I'm looking at is how that maps onto the evidence sets that a given identity orientation pays attention to and reacts to. So first one is that the orientations will impact the evidence set when they're making these decisions. Secondly, I'll draw on identity salience and centrality, because again, not all identities are particularly salient in a given moment, but the more salient and the more central that identity is in that particular situation, then that will lead that funder to having more distinct evidence for that funder identity type, and then also more distinct from the other identity orientations. That will really make an impression on what evidence sets they look at compared to the other identity orientations. Then as their capability increases, and this comes as a result of experience, each within, again, now I'm talking about within each funder identity orientation, they start looking at less evidence. So they know what works, they know what they like, they know what they pay attention to, they focus on less and less evidence, and it also becomes more distinct. Individualistic identity-oriented people focus on certain elements of information, relational will look for others, and collectivistics will look for yet others. And they become more experienced, and they start focusing on that narrower set. So similarly, as their capacity increases, meaning they have more attention related to the task, it's kind of a similar process unfolds. And then the last two I'll get to relate to accountability. So this, again, this is something I think we don't see very much of in the decision-making literature relating to entrepreneurial finance, and I think it should be, because this is definitely part of the process in many situations. So the way this breaks down is there's both procedural accountability, which is basically, am I going to be accountable for this decision, the process that I use to make this decision? And this means, okay, I make a decision, I've got to be accountable for this to someone. So think about a venture capitalist or an angel investor who needs to report back to the group, or the associate who needs to report back to the partner, and so on and so forth. As their procedural accountability increases, again, they want to look at more evidence because they want to make sure that they go through the process that they have to justify to someone at a later stage. So look at more evidence, but it also will be more distinct. So they start focusing on the evidence that they think most is in line with that identity orientation, because they're going to have to justify that later at a later date, and it'll be easier if it's more in concert with the identity orientation that they have. On the other hand, if they have to be accountable for the outcome, meaning it's not the process that they have to be accountable for, but it's the results of it, that tends to induce stress. And when stress happens, then people become less focused. So the decision makers in this context will start taking a more stressful situation where they won't consider much of the evidence, and they won't really be very focused on it. So you'll see they won't consider a lot of evidence. At the same time, they won't be very consistent in the types of evidence they focus on. So those are the sets of propositions. Again, what I hope to do with this work is not say we don't need to do signaling anymore, but we can enhance it really a lot better by incorporating elements of the funder, him or herself, and the context in which they're making that decision. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pei Jia. I'm an assistant professor of entrepreneurship from California State University, San Bernardino. So today I'm very happy to be here to present my research co-authored with Dr. Sunny Lee Song from UMass Lowell. So the title of my research I'm going to present is Tell Me a Story, a Sense-Making and Sense-Giving Perspective. So the background before this research is that in entrepreneurship education, we always tell students that it is important to tell story to your investors, to your customers. So storytelling is very important. And in the prior research, it's the storytelling, the role of organizational narrative has also been emphasized. And the narratives are shown to be important in entrepreneur resource acquisition and also to deal with different situations in the entrepreneur journey. So this study, we focus on the role of entrepreneur, the IPO narratives. So we look at a specific context, that is those companies going IPO. How do these companies tell their stories in IPO, and how those narratives affect investors' perceptions of these IPOs. So the main research question we want to answer in this piece of research are what is considered like a good storytelling in IPO context, and how does a venture storytelling, those narratives, affect investors' perception, and as a result, their valuation and their IPO premium. And does venture capital-backed ventures tell a better story or not? Okay. We use the sense-making and sense-giving framework to find the answer to these research questions. So sense-making is a social process that constructs a plausible meaning of what is happening retrospectively through interpretation of the environment and interactions with others. So Wick 1993, this paper is the seminal work of sense-making and sense-giving. So basically, in this work, he discussed, he used the sense-making and sense-giving to analyze the Mango tragedy. So the sense making is required when the organization is experiencing a drastic change. And we argue that using this sense-making and sense-giving perspective in this study is appropriate because when those companies they go public, they are actually experiencing a drastic change because they are going from private to public. So there's going to be a lot of change, and their reference frame, the existing frame of reference would be no longer viable, and to explain, to make sense of the current situation. So the top management of these IPO companies, they as a sense maker, they need to gather the information and make sense of the current situation, and also trying to give sense to other stakeholders. Okay, so influence the investors and stakeholders' perceptions. We specifically look at the narratives in the IPO setting, because sense-making can be viewed as an act of invention, and its outcome includes language game and text. So in IPO setting, we argue that the narratives are those IPO prospectors. So basically, those top management, they come up, they brainstorm and they revisit their entrepreneur journey, and they make sense of the situation, and they come up with IPO prospectors with other stakeholders like the underwriters and even venture capitalists. And these prospectors serve as two main roles. One is it is the outcome of their sense making, and the other role it is a channel through which those top management of those IPO companies, they deliver their story, and those stories are going to be understood by the investors. So we specifically focused on the two types of narratives. One, we called it entrepreneur narratives. So it's related to entrepreneur orientation, and those entrepreneur narratives is manifested in the prospectors. And the other type of narratives, we call it customer narratives. So it's more focused on customers. So these are some examples. For instance, in Uber's IPO prospectors, they mentioned that to ignite opportunity by setting the world in motion, we revolutionize personal mobility with ride sharing, and we are leveraging our platform to redefine the massive meal delivery and logistic industries. So this type of narrative we defined as entrepreneur narratives, and on the other hand, customer narratives is more related to the customer orientations. So here is the theoretical framework in this research. So we argue that the venture capital-backed ventures, they tend to have like higher level of entrepreneur narratives in their prospectus, in their IPO narratives, and also the higher level of customer narratives. And these two types of narratives can positively influence their the investors' perception. So as a result, they get higher IPO premium. We collect data from different sources like SDC database, also the CEEC, BoardX, and CompuStat. And our final sample consists of 1,838 new ventures that initiated their IPO during the period from 2005 to 2019. And following the IPO research, we excluded all the financial industry companies here. Okay, the measurement, we measure the IPO premium as the difference between the offer price and their and the book value per share divided by their book value per share. And for EN, the entrepreneur narratives, and CN, customer narratives, we use tax analysis. Basically, we pull all those prospectors and put them into this LIWC data software, and then we measure these two constructs. And the dictionary we used for EN is from Short and co-authors 2010. So basically, they measure the different dimensions of entrepreneur orientation. And in customer narratives, we use the dictionary developed by Zachary and co-authors 2011. And then we, because our model is a mediation model, we tested this model using PIS and SEM. And this is the measurement model result, and we can see that the alpha reliability and also the AVE, they're at a satisfactory level. And this is the result of the structural model result. So as prior literature has already showed that the VC-backed ventures, they have higher IPO premium. So investors give higher valuation to those VC-backed companies. And our hypothesis focused on the mediation effect, on the narratives. So we can see our hypothesis 1, 2, 3, 4, they are all supported with so the VC-backed ventures, they have higher level of ENs and CNs, and the higher level of ENs and CNs, they are associated with like higher IPO premium. And this is the mediation analysis, and we can see the direct effect of venture-backed, being a venture-backed IPO company is about like 61%, and the rest of 39% of the effect are through this narrative effect, so this indirect effect. Okay, this is the past diagram. These are the control variables we control, so we can see the significance here. Okay, so we also conducted a post hoc analysis to look at what is going to happen in crisis. Our data covers the period of financial crisis from 2007 to 2009. So we are interested in whether these indirect effect, the proposed mediation effect, also exist in the crisis. Because financial crises, they present challenges for companies, and they also create these uncertainties and negative sentiment in the investment. In the investors, so we want to see whether the proposed mediation effect still exists in financial crisis. And interestingly, we can see that actually the specific direct effect, they no longer significant. And in the past analysis, we found out that the direct effect of being VC-backed ventures is still positive and significant, and the underwriter reputation begins to have a positive and a significant sign. So it may indicate that the investors in this crisis situation, they could not use the extracted cues to make sense of that situation. So they no longer care about what you write in your prospectus, what you say. So they resort to clear signals such as underwriter reputation and venture capital presence as an evaluation tool to make their judgment about IPO firm's quality. Okay, I also discussed the signaling theory and sense-making theory, and as Dr. Serge just mentioned, many of the entrepreneur financing literature, they use signaling theory, but in this research, we focus on the sense-making and trying to provide a new perspective to look at how those investors may make their financing decisions, and how the narratives affect their evaluation of those entrepreneur companies. Okay, so here are some contributions. So I hope to get some feedbacks from the audience. Okay, thank you.
My name is Ren. I am from the Michael Institute for Intellectual Property. I know that we have a lot of educators in here. Anyone teach IP in your classes? Yes. And what's the process been like for you on that?
They love it, but students love this topic.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. you're not a lawyer. If you're not a lawyer.
Yeah, the subject material is like pretty dense. It's a lot of legalese. You're basically learning a whole new specialty if you're teaching it. So we are a nonprofit organization who is helping to change that. Our mission is to empower students, entrepreneurs, inventors, creators, educators with the knowledge and success needed to succeed in the global economy. I'm here today to share with you some learnings from our Educators in Residence program. It was a 2-year collaboration of educators from NACCE, the National Association for Community College, working on intellectual property education. These are our Educators in Residence, or EIRs. In our pilot program, the Institute provided funding and support for colleges from across the country to develop and integrate innovative IP curricula into a variety of disciplines, from business to engineering to the creative arts. And the goal of the initiative was to use their experience doing so to create a guide for other educators, focusing on practical applications of free and openly licensed intellectual property curriculum. It also allows any educators who are looking to be champions for intellectual property, it gives them resources to do that as well. So one of our colleges, Springfield Technical Community College, you can see here all of the work that they did. They embedded a lot of it into courses, including history of Springfield. How do you implement IP into history? There are ways to do that. And they had a lot of publications. They spoke on the radio. There was conference presentations as well. Essentially, Diane and John, who are our educators in residence from STCC, just tried to include as many activities and inclusions as they could into all of their curriculum. So you might be wondering, what exactly is IP education? You can think of IP education as a pathway for student ideas to be taken into real-world action and value. IP education will help guide students, educate them on the value of their IP, allow professors of all levels of experience to be equipped with the knowledge to help defend their IP, provide guidance and coaching and strategies for student entrepreneurs and student business owners. IP education is particularly important within entrepreneurship education. Student entrepreneurs can be faced with an overwhelming amount of information and guidance when they plan their startup ventures. One area that is often neglected is intellectual property. Student business owners need to know what to protect, when, and how to protect it. For example, IP can be leveraged as a business asset. It can be used to secure investments and venture funding, and it can be sold outright or licensed to raise money for revenue. IP education is student-centric. A student's own idea becomes the focus of the lesson, and it creates an instant connection between the student and the lesson outcome. IP education has real-world applications by placing even the most underrepresented students at the center of their learning experience, meeting them where they are and empowering them to have control and profit from their creations. It also provides this opportunity for each student to harness the power of their ideas. IP education is critical thinking and problem solving for launching new ventures. Student entrepreneurs are constantly assessing their business plans using models such as a SWOT analysis. IP begets new IP. An inventive culture fosters creativity and new solutions to the problems. IP education is also digital literacy for today's high-tech economy. Increasingly, IP is arguably the chief engine of wealth creation and economic growth in the world. Recent research has found that nearly half of millennials plan to start a business within the next 3 years. We know that Gen Z is very much turning towards the creator economy. Everyone wants to become a YouTube star or Instagram influencer, but they don't think about their branding, and before you know it, they are losing out on a lot of economic benefits. IP education is therefore vital, as any young person today who does not understand at least the basics of intellectual property and its value and role in science, business, arts, and the professions will find himself or herself at a distinct disadvantage in the world of tomorrow. IP is also multidisciplinary, with applications across business, STEAM, design, and more. And while it's not realistic to think that all students can reach a full understanding of all of these areas, it does push students to go outside of their comfort zone, outside of their subject matter comfort zone, in order to acquire a holistic understanding of the technical, legal, and commercial worth of their intellectual property rights. So with all these amazing benefits, why do we need to teach IP? Our EIRs believe it to be the most adaptable, real-world subject matter to teach. Lack of basic awareness that ideas can translate into real property ownership and obtaining IP rights is the primary means to achieve this. And there's a lack of understanding that intangible assets also have monetary value. Lastly, and most importantly, to Michelson Institute, IP education removes barriers to opportunities for entrepreneurial students and underrepresented populations. So, how can IP education help solve these problems? The Michelson IP curriculum provides a wide range of educational resources that help students progress from the learning stages, awareness, to train students on the details of IP creation, ownership, and management. To begin, we have simple entry-level animated videos and infographics that can be used to enlighten students about the components of IP. They're short, they don't have legalese, they're made for anyone who really has no background on IP and just wants to take their first steps into learning about patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. And once students move on to master the beginning subjects, you can utilize more detailed resources, including our open access textbook, which we know that we have a lot of trouble getting really good quality open access materials. And our materials were written by David Klein, who is a Pulitzer Prize nominated IP expert. And it was edited by the former Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the Patent Office, David Kapos, as well. And the book is accompanied by an interactive ebook with learning assessment tools as well. So this is an example of the roadmap, and you can see that it starts all the way from inside the classroom to outside the classroom, and even within the community, which seems to be the theme of today, is connecting with the community. So for example, in the classroom, just utilizing the Michelson IP curriculum, we have like plug and play LMS modules that you can just incorporate into your existing courses. And then our EIRs also recommended having speakers outside of the classroom come in just to fill in the gaps of understanding a little bit more. And then, yeah, also hosting IP and entrepreneurship events and doing outreach to K-12 within the local community. I will leave you with this. By promoting intellectual property education, the Michelson Institute is helping to create a more knowledgeable, empowered workforce while fostering economic development and a culture of inclusive innovation and entrepreneurship across the country. I do have samples of the guidebook with me. I'll leave them up here afterwards if any of you want to walk away with that. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
We will now open up the room for any questions you might have or any presenters.
For the two researchers, how would you suggest we use your papers in class? What is some of the stuff that you've found that we should be thinking about from a classroom perspective?
That's an excellent question. So I do think, in some level, this concept of the identity is something that will resonate well with the students. And I think you can certainly I can certainly envision designing activities around having exercises where they have to make decisions based on evidence that's presented to them, and presumably those will map onto some of their underlying identities or motivations. So I think from that standpoint, it does inform them, because in some respect, I do think we need to move away from emphasizing making the right decision. I mean, these are right, potentially, if it's your motivation is financial return, these are the things you may want to pay attention to, but that's not the motivation that everybody has. And I think in our classrooms, again, I feel like we tend to really push people making a so-called right decision, whereas what's right for one funder may not be right for someone else.
I think in terms of teaching entrepreneurship, because my study primarily on the narratives perspective. So we teach students how important the narratives is, like storytelling is. But what I observe in class is that those students, they do not like pay a lot of attention in like construction of their maybe writing, like their communications with investors or potential customers. So maybe this type of research can encourage the student to think more, to make sense of maybe like the founder, they need to make sense of their current situation in trying to construct their narratives in an effective way so that they can influence maybe their potential investors' perception or their potential customers' perception. So I think that could be used as a learning point in the classroom.
So, Ren, can you tell us a little bit more about the background of your organization? How old is it? How did, what was the origin story? Because obviously it's a wonderful resource that I'm sure we will all be using, but I'm curious as to how it, how long it's been around, how it came about.
Yeah, so forgive me. I'm in month 6 of this position. Yeah, they got me working hard already. No. So actually, it's a really interesting story. The founder is Gary Michelson, and he is a currently self-made billionaire. So he grew up, he grew up almost homeless and ended up making his way through college, became a doctor, spinal surgeon, and he is like a really big guy. He's got these massive hands, and as a surgeon, you have to be really delicate. So he was like, these instruments are not going to work for me. And also he just discovered, I think, new solutions to old problems as well. So he got a lot of, patents, and that was really where he made a lot of his money. And so he was like, you know what? A lot of people need to know about this. The organization, we're part of like a larger philanthropy, 20mm, and so all of our initiatives, all of our programs are focused within education, but ours is specifically intellectual property. And we started in 2017, 2016, so it's still fairly new. So some of our programs, we're working with NACE, so trying to get IP education into community colleges. We're working with HBCUs as well, and entrepreneurship centers within there. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent presentation, all three. I have a question. It's more, does the sense making and storytelling has an influence? I didn't understand the results. So does it has a good impact on VCs or it doesn't? And can you add like profitability on that equation when doing the research?
Okay, thank you for your question. So basically the results shows that two types of narratives, we specifically look at the entrepreneur narratives and customers narratives. They have positive and significant effect on the IPO premium, which means that those companies which incorporate like more like show higher level of entrepreneur narratives and customer narratives in their prospectus, they usually got higher like investor valuation and the IPO premium. So basically, it's because traditionally previous research they focus more on the signaling effect. Like the VC-backed companies are considered like higher quality compared to non-VC-backed companies, and those companies who have like prestigious underwriters, sometimes they receive higher IPO like premium. So this research wants to use another perspective, that's a narrative perspective. So the past analysis actually show that in addition to the direct effect of being VC-backed, there's also a narrative effect. So how they construct their narratives actually can help them influence the investors' perception. I hope I answered your question.
And about the financial, can that be correlated to what your findings? Because, given a good story without the financial backing it up.
I do control all these variables like the return, some variables on their financial statement. So even like teasing out this effect, narratives can still have some impact on the IPO premium.
I hope you don't mind me asking questions, although I'm the moderator. But I found your research is very interesting. Dr. Chirsta, so the identities, are these identify the funders themselves? Or is it the identities of the funders? Is it identified by the funders themselves? Or is it something that the entrepreneurs would perceive by examining these funders?
So these are the underlying identities that the funder would have. But sort of go back to your question too, there are ways that the entrepreneur can make them more salient. So that might be something also to emphasize in the classroom is if I'm going to try and make a individualistic or relational identity salient in a funder, there may be some things I want to communicate or convey. But those are the underlying identities of the funders themselves. They're not conveyed on them by the entrepreneurs.
I was just curious whether there would be ways entrepreneurs could better identify the identities of the funders, which could possibly make the evidence more effective when they're communicating with the funders.
Yeah, that's a great, I definitely think that would be something to how research could build on this framework, because I definitely could see that mechanism happening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And Dr. Jia, thank you for your interesting research. I was rather curious why you're only focusing on VC-backed ventures, because these narratives, from my understanding, I'm not like an expert on the IPO process, but I thought these narratives could also play a large role for non-VC-backed ventures, because non-VC-backed ventures, they don't have the VC support. So I thought they could even more better leverage these narratives when they're communicating or perhaps sending out signals to the public, which could have an effect on IPO premium. But, did you consider, or was there a reason why you're only looking at VC-backed ventures?
So one of the reasons is about like investigating maybe the difference between a signaling effect and the sense-making and sense-giving perspective. Because we know that a lot of studies focusing on how VC influence the firm's valuation, they all focus on the signaling effect. So by looking at those direct effect and the indirect effect through narratives, we actually can have a better understanding of how these narratives influence the outcome. It's not like just certification effect, like signal effect. And actually, in the hypothesis development, there's like a detailed explanation, like why those VC-backed companies, they tend to focus more on the entrepreneur aspect and the customer aspect, so that when they are trying to make sense in the IPO process, they will be more likely to extract the cues of entrepreneur orientation, customer orientation. So as a result, their prospectors may have more narratives related to those two orientations.
On the IP syllabus, how should we use that? Is it flexible? Can we use it in a semester-long class or a workshop, or how is it formulated?
Yeah, so I would say that most of the educator materials are going to be formulated for use throughout one term. And so we do have outlines of syllabi for a full term if you want to do a full IP class. We have Introduction to Intellectual Property and then Law for the Entrepreneur. But we also have, like I said, the Canvas modules that you can go through. And so it's a full one, and then there's an ultralight and a light version, and then you can also just take pieces and put that in and work it really into wherever it fits within your syllabus or within your schedule. Yeah.
So we could build, so for our summer accelerator program this year, could we
Yeah.
build just like a 2-hour
Yeah.
or an hour and a half little session?
Yeah, what I would recommend, we can definitely connect after as well, but usually like with workshops, because it is a lot of information still, we usually recommend that before the workshop some of the materials get sent out just for students to do a little bit of review, and then we can also have like speakers as well from the Michelson Institute just to talk about and introduce intellectual property as well. Yeah.